María.
Hola, soy Laura. Bienvenidos al Refugio de Fantasía, un espacio para los amantes de la fantasía y para todo aquel que quiera sumergirse en este mundo.
Acompáñanos en este viaje a través de la imaginación. Bienvenidos a la temporada 2. En esta trataremos los cuentos de hadas y su relación con la fantasía. Para esto conversaremos sobre narradores, recopiladores, escritores y editores de cuentos de hadas, sobre retellings y adaptaciones, y también sobre su historia y la teoría que hay alrededor de su origen y difusión. En el capítulo de hoy estaremos hablando con Jack Sipes acerca de los estudios del folclor y los cuentos de hadas. Empecemos.
Jack Sipes nació en 1937 en Nueva York. Es profesor emérito de alemán, literatura comparada, estudios culturales, literatura infantil y folclor. Ha publicado gran cantidad de libros sobre cuentos de hadas, ha realizado traducciones y ediciones de estos cuentos. También ha escrito teoría y tiene una editorial llamada Little Mouse and Honeybird.
Okay, so Professor Sipes, welcome once again to El Refugio de Fantasía, or the Fantasy Shelter. It is such an honor to have you here with us today.
Right. Oh, it's my pleasure.
Okay, so we would like to start our conversation asking you, how did you come to work with folklore and fairy tales?
Well, when it would be a very long story if I told you everything, but I began studying at Columbia University in New York City for my PhD, and during that time, I spent 2 years also studying in Germany. And I decided to focus when I returned to America after studying in Germany. This is in the 1960s, about 1962 or 3. I decided to write on the romantic hero in German and also American literature. And so I wrote a book called The Great Refusal, Studies of the Romantic Hero in German and American Literature. And that included some of the great writers from in America, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, and in Germany, Novalis, and Ludwig Tieck, and E.T.A. Hoffmann, and so on and so forth. And but I never planned to really go much further in the study of fairy tales until I moved from New York City. I was teaching at the New York University. I went to the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and I had a wonderful partner, and she was studying children's education and focusing on that. And during doing my research, I began to really, and I was working also on the Brothers Grimm and Anderson and many other 19th century writers. A book was published by Bruno Bettelheim that dealt with a Freudian approach to fairy tales. This was about this would have taken place about 1970s. Okay, about 1978. And his book was, I felt his book really did not understand children. That there were misinterpretations, and that the Freudian approach really was not the best way to understand the impact of fairy tales on children. And of course, I was always reading my partner. She was a wonderful teacher of children at that time. And so I was reading a lot of her books. And I said, something is wrong with Bruno Bettelheim and the approach, the Jungian approach to fairy tales. And so I decided to test his theories and my theories by working with children as a storyteller in a school for every week, for once a week, for 2 hours. And I did that for an entire year and took notes. And I became fascinated by the way children react and receive. We're talking children about 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, in that elementary school we call in America. And I also found out that Bruno Bettelheim plagiarized his theories from some other colleague, and that he really was a imposer. He had no degrees when he came to America. He really had no degrees in psychology or anything like that. And so I became very seriously concerned about children's literature, about fairy tales, about the oral traditions, the folklore that in every country is different. And that was sort of what got me into years after that of writing books and studying. And of course, I taught other things like critical theory, the philosophy of the Frankfurt School, and that includes Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, and many other. I also have written a great deal on Ernst Bloch, who is a philosopher, a great philosopher in the 20th century. And so, that's how everything started.
We didn't know that Bettelheim has plagiarized his work.
Oh, yes. I've written 2 essays about him in my books. You can read about it in Breaking the Magic Spell. By the way, one of Breaking the Magic Spell was translated into Spanish, but in the second edition to Breaking the Magic Spell, I added a lot of things that I didn't know later on. So yes, I've written 2 long essays about, and it's very. I think that it's a disgrace to theory, and also there's some 2 biographies about him and parents. He had an institute for autism in Chicago, and he was sued by some people because he really didn't know what he was doing.
That's a shock, a big shock the big shock of the day. And taking into account that you are a scholar, a professor about folklore and fairy tales, we want to ask you, what is a fairy tale?
What is a fairy tale?
Yeah, that's a question. We know that for that question, there is not an answer, but what is a fairy tale for you?
Yes. Well, it's a very complicated, to really understand what a fairy tale is. You have to be, I think, very, let me say, open to the fact that there is no pure genre in any kind of literature. In other words, the fairy tale takes in ghost stories, animal stories, stories about soldiers, and so on and so forth. But what the fairy tale tends to do, or what, let us say, going way back, you could go back to the Egyptian period. We're talking, way before Christ, at least 4,000 years before, that tales were told that were magical, that involved transformation. So the key understanding of all types, and there are many types of fairy tales, is not just one type. And so, but key to what has to happen in most fairy tales is that there's some sort of magical transformation, miraculous transformation, in which somebody quite often is turned into an animal, or an animal turns into a human being. And it depends on the animals. Sometimes they're pigs. Sometimes they become hawks and fly and things like that. So that is the sort of key to sort of begin to write about the structure of fairy tales. Now, another key thing about fairy tales, there are different motifs or different, let us say, aspects to the genre of the fairy tale. And a really superb scholar by the name of his name just slipped on my mind, but it'll come back to me, argues And I agree with him, or he doesn't argue, but he tries to say that the other aspect with regard to fairy tales is a utopian aspect. And that is, most fairy tales deal with other worlds. So they're allegories. They tend to be allegories symbolically representing key issues with regard to the way people live in a different way in the plot and structure of the fairy tale, of the story. So, in other words, we all really are dissatisfied with our present world. But let us go back hundreds or thousands of years. People were always dissatisfied and longed for a better world, longed for a world in which they might explore themselves freely and prosper and share what the work that they do. So, in other words, it's a imaging of what the world, how the world could be in a different way. So that is also key for understanding the meaning of fairy tales, because almost all human beings are long for a different kind of world, a world in which they will fit in better, and a world in which they will not face danger all the time. And so the fairy tales really are crucial existentially in for all of us to understand the world. And that's why they are told, because we relieve ourselves, or we release our fears or longings in these tales, and picture how life could be somewhat different and better than it is. So you have a transformation, okay, magical transformation. The world is transformed, the real world transformed into these narratives that we create in our imaginations, and in these allegorical, symbolical world, metaphorical world, we explore the possibility of changing our present world. So I think those are two key elements. And we have to remember that there is no such thing as a pure fairy tale. A fairy tale sort of preys upon other genres and vice versa. In other words, you have legends, okay, legends of a city. A city has a particular legend. It's generally not true. It's generally fictitious or becomes fictitious. And so the legend, which supposedly is about a singular incident or hero or something like that, these tales are, let us say, they are exploited by the genre of the fairy tale. They bring a tale like the Pied Piper, for instance. Is that a fairy tale or is that a legend? Some people call it a legend, some people call it a fairy tale, but it can be both because they are not the boundaries in fantasy. The boundaries in fantasy are not set. Our imaginations really take anything or everything that we think will enable us to understand our world better, and use these things in ways that we can sort of help share our ideas with other people, but also we can relieve ourselves of the tensions that we feel in everyday life. So one of the reasons fairy tales are the only genre that begins when children are about 1 or 2 years old until we die. It's the only genre that does that. For instance, a sonnet or a novel or all these other genres, we start learning about them when we're older. Okay, and then we sometimes forget them. But the fairy tale, because we pass these fairy tales on to our children and so on, it's the only genre that stays with us. I've experienced as an experiment, whenever I travel, and I travel a lot, or used to travel a lot until the virus came, I did a lot of work in Europe, and I would go into a classroom and I would say, how many of you know Little Red Riding Hood? And all of a sudden, everybody raises their hand. Of course, then I do a test because they really don't know the text all that well, or the different versions all that well. But what it does underlie, or it verifies, so to speak, the fact that these tales spread like memes. They're like memes, and they spread, and they're very important because a tale, like when you really interpret or understand how the fairy tale works, you learn that the more metaphorical images and plots are still connected to our everyday lives because they are mimetic. And by mimetic, I mean that and this is a meme is what Richard Dawkins in his book, the about genes, that he invented the term meme. And a meme is like a gene. It's part of your makeup, so to speak, and it sticks in your brain. A meme sticks in your brain because it deals with something that is vital to understand in our cultures. Now, that means that why is Little Red Riding Hood popular in no matter what country you go to? Okay, and different. It'll of course be somewhat different, and so on and so forth. But it's there. And it is there because it's a story about rape. It's a story about the violation of a young girl who is accused of, in the tale, more or less, of being stupid because she gathered flowers, and the wolf gets to the house and then eats up the granny and eats her up. And in some versions, she's saved by a hunter. And in other versions, she's just eaten up at the end. Now, the tale, so the tale has been used in hundreds of different ways, but it's still there in most cultures throughout the world because we have not resolved the problem of violence to women. And the tale is a sort of warning tale. The tale is it's a tale that really is necessary to be told in all cultures in different ways, but it has to deal with the relationship of men's domination over women, and we can then take other tales like that, like Hansel and Gretel, is a tale of abandoning children because of poverty, and so on. And we haven't dealt so in our world today. Children are being murdered, killed, destroyed, abandoned in a way that is horrible. And so when I also go into a classroom anywhere in the world, they will understand that right away because they experience that or know about children who have experienced that and things like that. So that's I know I've gotten off the beaten track a bit, but in defining the fairy, you can't define the fairy tale in any absolute way. You can talk about what constitutes, what are the elements, what are the motifs, what are the plots in different fairy tales. But there are certain key things that we have to look for in order to say, yes, that is sort of a fairy tale. And like I said, it has to have miraculous types of transformations. And the second thing that it has to be able to reflect or project that other worlds are possible. That justice, that we can get some justice in our world. Right now, there is no justice. Okay, so these tales are very vital.
Okay, so keeping in mind the magical transformation and those other worlds that transform our own world, we would like to know if you think that there is a relationship between fantasy and fairy tales.
Yes, Oh, definitely. I mean, what we could, and I can tell you, I'm an old man, so I've lived a long time. There was no, let us say, compartment in bookstores called fantasy when I grew up. Can you believe that? The term fantasy was invented by bookstore owners. They didn't know what to do with books that really are a mixture of let us say, legends, children's stories, animal stories that are shaken up and turned up topsy turvy in ways that are very creative and go way beyond fairy tales, because a lot of what we call fantasy tends to be longer narratives. Fairy tales tend to be rather short, but in fantasy, uh, tends it is really not a genre. Okay, it's a a name that has been bestowed upon books that have an amazing amount of imaginative approaches to narrative that enable the author or the creator of a particular narrative a freedom that is unusual, unique, so that it really is so uncanny that it really strikes us in a certain way that we feel we can get lost in a labyrinth in these. You never get lost in the fairy tale, okay? But in all types of fantasy works, they're widespread in every culture. Like there are dragons who talk, or ghosts who turn into sheep, or this or that. So fantasy is basically a a term that people have used beginning, I would say the term started, was began spreading, I think, in the 1970s. That bookstores, they would, have, they used to have like a sections for myth, folklore, and fairy tales. And now they have a section of fantasy, which is somewhat different, than these other genres, but it's really not a genre, because basically these are works that we can trace back to, like, Alice in Wonderland. What is Alice in Wonderland? Fantasy. It's not a fairy tale, right? And there are many other examples. We can go back to the medieval period and find amazing books that we would today say, well, that's belongs to the fantasy. And I won't say genre, because it's not a genre. Fantasy explodes any type of categorization of of the narratives in which a particular author writes. So fantasy exists, and in fact, there are more and more. What do you call Harry Potter, which is a fantasy? Is it a fairy tale? A fantasy? What is it? I would say it is a fantasy that has a very strong fairy tale elements in it, but it's not a fairy tale, and so on and so forth. So basically, as I said before, the term fantasy has been coined by bookstore owners in America, at least, and ever since then, it's spread throughout the world. And I'm not sure, about every culture whether they label things in the fantasy section of the bookstore or not. But it's a key word that indicates this is going to be a really unusual book.
Before, you were talking about Red Riding Hood.
Yes.
That tale has representation of the violence that women have gone through, like since a long time ago. So we have been reading your work, and we knew writers, recollectors as Laura Gonsenbach or Rachel Bosk. And we want to ask you, how does gender affect the compilation, traduction, and edition of fairy tale.
Yeah, what is wonderful, I mean, there have always been really superb female writers, but it took some time for female writers really to develop because of the fact that in most parts of the world, they were not allowed to read or write, not allowed, they were not educated in a way that they could read, write, and so on. In most societies, and some societies even today, inhibit the development of women as thinkers, as writers, and so on and so forth. So we have to bear that in mind. That for the majority, in most cultures, the majority of writers and artists were men up through, let's say, the 17th or 18th or 19th centuries. But there were, the term fairy tale, conte de fées, was basically invented by Madame d'Aulnoy, a French writer, during the 1690s, the same period in which Charles Perrault was writing his fairy tales. In fact, women were better writers at fairy tales than the men. But of course, they had a lot of difficulty getting their works published and known because of the fact that they were limited in terms of where they could go, what they say, and so on and so forth. So one of the wonderful things, at least in the 20th and 21st centuries, is that women had equal opportunity, not always complete equal opportunity, but it's grown. And so that in particular, you have waves in which certain female writers have made a major contribution to the understanding of gender conflict in fairy tales. And a great example, of course, is Angela Carter. And she published a book, I'm forgetting the title of the book, but it'll come back to me, and in which she rewrote the fairy tales, and in a way that exposed a male prejudice and exposed the way that men dominated or tried to dominate women. But she was, of course, not the only one. Anne Sexton in America, a great poet, actually about the same time that Angela Carter was writing, also contributed to this, so that there was I think in America, the second wave of feminism, which began in the 1960s and 70s, late 60s and 70s, contributed so much to the development of the fairy tale that I would say that today the best writers of fairy tales for children, adults, or mixed audiences, the best writers are women writers because of the fact that they really are very critical of how men treat women, and not only how men treat women, but how, the conditions of the world and so on. They take different, generally speaking, radical perspectives and develop radical fairy tales that are, and of course, not all of them do that or do that well, but they try. But I would say that at least in America, the best writers today of fairy tales tend to be women. And it's because of the fact that they're rebels and trying to show or expose the contradictions of their culture and trying to point to possible ways we can resolve these conflicts. And as I said, the fairy tale genre is somewhat utopian or idealistic. They try to project new worlds in their writings. And I know also in South America, there are some excellent writers of fantasy and fairy tales who are doing that as well. Perhaps not as much as in America because of the difficulties. There are greater difficulties, I think, in South America. But it's going on. And no matter where you go, to Brazil or Argentina and so on, and Colombia. So it's still a very a genre that also is significant because if you have oppressive governments, and unfortunately that exists, a lot of writers use what I call slave language. Slave language is a language that is only understood by other slaves, and they generally are code. In other words, they generally are symbolic codes that reflect upon, that exposes a dictator, exposes corruption, exposes the fact that there's no justice, and so on. And so the term slave language, and it's not my term, it was actually invented by Bertolt Brecht, a German writer, Sklavensprache in German, was used by people to communicate with one another so that they won't get arrested and thrown into jail. In other words, if you invent your own language, in other symbols and so on, that's so complex, the stupid governments or corrupt people won't understand it, but you're sharing something with other people who love, imaginative writings and so on. Generally speaking, dictators are unfortunately dumb. Not I say unfortunately, unfortunately, because they just want one thing. They want power. But the fairy tales show that power can destroy a lot of people, and also dictators can be exposed if you symbolically write or metaphorically write about them and show how stupid or how greedy they are and how dominant they are. And these fairy tales, like I've published, I think one of the great writers of fairy tales is Laboulaye, Edouard Laboulaye, Labouyae. And I've published one of his books in my series at Princeton, in which he was a lawyer and professor in the 19th century in France, and he opposed the Second Napoleon and used to write these fairy tales that dealt with power and exposed everything that the French were doing to dominate the world, trying to dominate the world. And his fairy tales are just superb, and also feminist. He was a feminist before the time men became feminists. So the fairy tale has a really fantastic or amazing history, because behind all writers and the best fairy tales who use this code, sort of metaphorical, as I said, code, they share that sort of in the underground with other people who are in the minority, who are suffering from the oppression of dictators. And like I said, a good example, of course, is in America, Donald Trump. He's so stupid. He's a stupid, disgusting, greedy man. And there are, stories written about him and so on. Not yet, no great story, but any story about a dictator, you would have to include him as being represented also. But I'm sure also in South America and Colombia, you have the same problem, that a lot of politicians are corrupt and a lot of politicians just want power.
Yes, and based on what you've mentioned, do you think that fairy tales could help us to comprehend the culture and social practices of others and also our present?
Yeah, I never preach myself what people should write and how. What I do look for, as I sometimes write tales myself or plays and things like that, I think that each artist, each writer has to find his or her own style, his or her own approach to the world. And if you're, and depending on what type of artist you are, because there are musicians, playwrights, many different types of artists in the world who use fairy tales and try to make some sort of contribution to our understanding of what is happening in our own culture. So it's very important, I think, personally, that all artists take into consideration how they can contribute to an understanding of what is actually happening in the world so that we don't kill each other and we don't kill the environment and destroy, animals. And this is occurring. The green movements throughout the world. There are, people who have, let us say, they have wakened up and become enlightened. They're not better than their, let's say, opponents, people who, let us say, and there are millions in America who believe in Trump and believe in his theories or what he says. So these people have to be somehow I think great writers. That doesn't mean you lower the quality of your writing, but I think one of the most important things to do is there are two approaches I generally take. One, to educate youngsters before institutions get to them. And by that I mean that all our institutions of learning are wrong because they generally impose writing, how to write, what to write about, how to act, how to do this. In other words, they make us into sort of conformists in an institutional way. So the first thing to do is to focus change on beginning at age 4 or 5 and to transform the educational systems so that children become storytellers of their own lives, so that they use their learning in a way so that they will be able to understand the gruesome things that are going on and the good things at the same time. And so that they begin thinking at a very early age, 3, 4, 5, 6, how to join together with others so that everybody shares in the fruits of the production by all social classes. So that's the first thing. The second thing that has to happen is that the education has to be free throughout the world. In other words, in America now, in order to go to college, you have to spend $40,000 or $50,000. That's ridiculous. That's terrible. That also means that only a select group of people can go and educate themselves about technology, about business, about philosophy, and so on and so forth. So we have to develop ways so that we all share, and not just a small percentage of the people, that we all share in the fruits, what people are producing together. And so that also means that we have to change the entire educational systems and enable all people from all different classes, enable them to find a way to enhance their understanding of the world by going to these, what we call higher institutions. And I think fairy tales, of course, can play a role in this. In Minneapolis, when I've been always a storyteller in public schools, and I developed in a book I wrote called Speaking Out, I developed a method based on Gianni Rodari, a great Italian writer. I developed a way that children can really start telling their stories, write their stories, act out their stories, and learn from one another. And I did that with the Children's Theater Company here in Minneapolis. And that began in 1995. And of course, unfortunately, the coronavirus put an end to that. But it's lasted for 20 years in 20 different schools. I trained 80 or 100 people to use my method and to work with teachers and children. And it's still going with, most of the people I work with here in Minneapolis, they're rebels. And so because they lost their jobs or they were part of this, program called Neighborhood Bridges. These young people, I call them young because everyone is young, according to me. They took, after they were released from their jobs, they formed their own methods based on my methods, and they've developed a program called Speaking Out. So they're in schools again. They're back in schools. They've gotten money to go into schools and work with them, with children and teachers. And there are other programs like that in the United States and other cultures. And that's the way we have to go. We have to share all our knowledge and not take that knowledge to just get power over other people or to make money. We have to share our knowledge so that everyone can produce what they want as long as they respect other people. And so that's sort of what I've been doing the last 20 or 30 years here in Minneapolis, aside from teaching at the university. And of course, I've been retired. As I said, I'm an old man. And so now I'm trying to do a lot of writing.
Well, that's amazing. We didn't know about all the work that you have made with children. I think that we both think we have to read Speaking Out. We just thought that. So now we want to ask you some questions that the listeners of our podcast sent to us.
Uh-huh.
The first one is, do you think there is a relationship between fairy tales and the classic books of children's literature?
Oh, yes, of course. It depends on the classical books tend to be really, I think every culture, every country, you have your classical writers for children and illustrators, and also we do. And I think that not all of the classical books are, let us say, have really great illustrations or, let us say, enlighten children or help children to understand the world. So I think that we have to be very careful about when we say these classical books should be read and sold to children or families and so on. I don't know whether you heard about the recent incident here in America with Dr. Seuss. Well, the political correctness movement in America has two sides to it. One is the rebellion side, in which people expose laws that are really oppressive for all groups, and the other side is sort of almost legally setting up. The other side is a little too pedantic. That's it. That's the word I was looking for. Pedantic, and they want to prevent certain books from being published. So I'm talking in the case of Dr. Seuss, who was a great writer in the 1930s and 40s and wrote, I don't know how many books, well over 100 books or so. They found out that the portrayal of certain groups of people was sort of stereotypical and racist. That's some of the images. Not all, this is a man who wrote 100 books or more, and he's dead. He's been dead for a long time, and there's actually a society that publishes his books. Now, they withdrew. This is only a recent exposure. They withdrew his books, these 4, 5, or 6 books, and were forced to. Otherwise, people would strike, or not strike, but would not buy any of the other books and so on and so forth. So I was upset about that because of the fact that you had to take into consideration the context and time in which Seuss was writing. For instance, let us go back to Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. The Huckleberry Finn story, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, written in the 19th century by Mark Twain, had what some people would call negative images of Black people, African American people. And there have been tons of fights by to ban Huckleberry Finn from the schools and so on and so forth. And so there's a list of people, writers in America who may be, in quotes, classical or very good writers, whose works have not been republished or they're attacked, or only certain groups will buy their books and so on. My approach is simply, we have to let all voices speak, and we have to then talk about these books that have disparaging images of certain groups, and we have to try to understand. Maybe we can learn from the mistakes people made at a certain time. So to do away with these books or to prohibit them from being read we have to be very careful, because we border in doing that, we become oppressive, and we can't get the full truth of a particular period, because almost all books that are written, whether they're fantasy or not fantasy, reflect upon issues of their time. And so I'm for not celebrating, certainly not covering up for these writers, but trying to understand why they were famous during their time, why they still have some sort of impact on the way we look at the world today.
Okay, so another question is, which book would you recommend to someone who wants to study folklore and fairy tales, and which advice would you give them?
Oh, that's a question I can answer better in an email. I can send you a list at that time. Unfortunately, one thing I can say about what has happened in America at American universities, there used to be, when I taught in a department of German, Dutch, and Scandinavian languages, and I taught taught many things. I didn't just teach courses on fairy tales, although I would certainly once a year offer a course, or maybe twice a year. I would, but I taught many different things. Now, at my university, this is a university of 50,000 students. There is no department of folklore here. No department, even the Department of Anthropology. They may have some people interested in the oral traditions, but very few. So something is wrong in America, because when I began teaching, there were something like 10 universities that had very good programs in folklore. The best place is possibly the University of Indiana in America has a very good folklore department. And then UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles, also had a program. Well, today, there's only maybe one or two programs left out of maybe 10 to 20. And that's because, and again, this is a problem that we have to fight it, we have to really combat it, is that the humanities at American universities, what we call the humanities departments, generally tend to be the language departments, theater, art, sociology, basically courses that deal with the humanities. And all of these departments are being cut. My department, when I left the department in 2018, there were only 5 full professors when we used to have 20. And that's because universities have become more or less like businesses or corporations. And so that they consider, why should people read books? Why should people paint? Or why should people act? And so on and so forth. They're not going to earn any money. They're not going to help corporations. They're not going to be suited for corporations. And so that's the approach that most universities are taking these days. So that certainly, as I said, now there are only 2 departments in the United States in which folklore is taken seriously. There are individuals. In other words, if I were to recommend somebody to come to the United States who wants to study folklore and fairy tales, I would say, well, you probably should go to, say, Wolfgang Mieder in Vermont. But he's the only one at the University of Vermont who teaches folklore. He's very good. He's tremendous, and so on. But limited because of the fact that he doesn't have colleagues to share things with or develop the department. So the situation in America right now is very grim for the humanities. And unless there's a real change in the way we approach education in general, beginning with kindergarten or preschools, then we're going to have a public, or future generations will really not endorse or appreciate not only fairy tales, but just literature in general.
We have a lot of work to do. Maria and I, we have a lot of work to keep moving literature and making a sense of that to the lives of the future generation. And we want to ask you two last questions.
Yes.
First one is, which is your favorite fairy tale?
Well, I'm quite often asked that question, and most of the times people will think that Little Red Riding Hood would be my favorite. I've written a book called The Trials and Tribulations of Little Red Riding Hood, but it's not necessarily my favorite fairy tale. The tale that I like the most, for all sorts of reasons, is how 6 made their way into the world. And that's a wonderful tale in the Grimm's collection. But it goes back to Italy in the 17th, 16th, 15th century. And then there are many different versions, but it generally is about how soldiers, and it's I would say, very relevant to today's world as well, how most peasants in Europe, when they developed armies, most peasants were recruited whether they wanted to serve a king or not. In other words, they were dragged and forced to serve in the armies, and they generally were killed, quite a bit of them, more so than the upper classes who had horses and guns and things like that. So that the peasants were horrified, or when a recruiter would come along and drag them, into the army. So how 6 made their way through the world. It's about an ex-soldier who finishes after serving a king for about 10 years, and the king gives him a penny. And he says, what am I, after he has served, and he's penniless, and he's sent home. And he goes into the woods and is on his way home, and he sees a huge, strong man who's carrying trees on his back. And he says, where are you taking these trees? And, well, my grandmother needs this chopped wood. I've got to chop these trees into wood so she can have them for her stove. And the ex-soldier says, I could use somebody like you. And probably this giant of a man, it was an ex-soldier as well, And then they go along, and he says, okay, I'll go along with you. And they discover a guy who's shooting at something, and they don't know what he's shooting at. And they ask him, what are you shooting at? Well, you see about 10 miles down the way, there's a little ant on a wood fence, and I want to take practice to see if I can shoot it. And he does. And the ex-soldier says, oh my God, I could use somebody like you. And then they meet somebody who's holding his foot up behind him, ties it. And they say, why are you doing that? Well, I'm so fast that if I put my other foot on the ground, I can go around the world in about 2 minutes. And so they get him. And then there's somebody who can devour a huge amount of water or food or something like that. So there are 6 of them. And they find out that this king who fired the soldier is having a contest, that anybody who could beat his daughter in a race will have the daughter and half his kingdom. And so of course, the king doesn't even remember them, this ex-soldier. And the ex-soldier says, well, can I and my friends compete? And the king said, yes, but if you lose, you get your heads chopped off. Well, they have this race, and when they get to a certain point, they choose the fast runner races, and he's so fast he gets to the halfway mark and decides to rest and puts his head on a rock. And the friends see this and think he's going to lose the race. So the sharpshooter takes his gun and shoots the rock out from under the head of the runner. So he wakes up and realizes he better run fast and get back. And he easily does that. So they win. And the princess says, I'm not these slobs, these dirty men. I'm not going to marry any of them. And the king says, okay, I have a way to get rid of them. And so they try to kill them in an oven, but that doesn't work out. And then the king says, okay, you can take everything or anything you want from the castle, but you can't marry my daughter. And so the giant man who can carry anything on his back, they put gold and they wipe out the entire castle of the king, and they start moving out up north, to go to some other place. And the king gets very hostile, and he sends out soldiers to stop them. But these 6 men are so amazing that one of them can blow he can blow windmills hundreds of miles away. So he blows the soldiers back to the castle. And so the tale ends with these men sharing what they have, their booty, and that's it. And for me, it's a wonderful tale of how, the lower classes, use magical, remember this transformation, magical means to expose the king and his daughter and to share instead of having a so-called happy end, where a lower class guy marries an upper class princess. That's not what happens in this tale. So I just love that tale. And there are many different versions of it, and I've written about it. So that's my favorite tale.
Well, it was great to hear that story from you. Thanks for sharing it, and we'll look forward to hear more. And the last question we have is, what fantasy books do you recommend?
Well, I really, don't have a list like that. What I can tell you about, and I can also send you an interview that I've done once we're done here. I am writing many different things still, theory, about folk and fairy tales. I'm working on a book of my last essays, my final essays, before I stop writing. But that's aside the point. I've been a collector of fantasy and fairy tale books for many years. And we're talking about books, in the 19th century, 20th century books. I am addicted to bookstores, old bookstores, and flea markets. Anytime I go out and I sniff around, I've got my nose is like my dog. I have a wonderful poodle who's got the greatest nose in the world and can sniff anything. So I'm like my poodle. And so over the years, I have a library of about 5,000 books. It used to be 10,000, but I've given away a lot of these books. But I started looking at them about 2 years ago, and I discovered that in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, there were amazing writers for children whose works have not been republished, and that they are still relevant today. So, and I tried to convince some university presses to allow me to have my own series. I have my own series already with Princeton University Press. It's called Oddly Modern Fairy Tales. That's mainly for adults, fairy tales and unusual fantasy tales for adults. And so I wanted I looked at my collection because we were going to move to another house here in Minneapolis. And my wife said, I'm going to kick you out if you don't get rid of a lot of these books. So, but in trying to decide which books to keep, I found books that I like so much and are so unusual in their illustrations. And I couldn't convince the publishers to allow me to do 3 or 4 books a year. So I did 1 or 2 with the University of Minnesota Press that did well. And then I did 1 or 2 with Wayne State University Press, but they were, for me, too slow. And I really wanted to get these books out there, reprint them and so on, and write an introduction or an afterword. So I formed my own publishing house about 2 years ago called Little Mole and Honey Bear. And this little publishing house has now published about 5 or 6 books that are wonderful. If you send me your address, I will send you the copies of these books. That they're really fascinating. They were all done in 1920, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And so, unfortunately, I'm having financial problems because it's difficult to market your books during the coronavirus. But so what I'm trying to do, I can definitely recommend other books that are really good about fantasy and fairy tales. But the books that I'm doing now are amazing, just really amazing. They're illustrated and written by the same authors. One is a woman by the name of Dorothy Burrows. Another is a Hungarian, and I've translated these books. One is a painter, and Christian Beermann, a German who died in 1924 and wrote a wonderful book about a giant owl and so on, and how he saves a town from an epidemic. It's a story about epidemics, and but with amazing 40 illustrations that I reprinted in a small book for children. So this is what I'm doing. I'm in my 80s right now, so I don't have that much time left on this planet. So I'm trying to do about 4 or 5 of these books every year. And that's where I'm spending all my time. A lot of these books I translate from Italian, German, French, and what other. I do a little Spanish too. That used to be my best language. It's now my worst. And that's because I never followed. I went to live in these countries and lived and worked there, in Italy and France and Germany. So that's what I've been doing. So I can recommend these books to you, and I can if you send me your one. I just need one mailing address, and I'll send that to you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. We see you as a master, as a person we can follow, we can learn so much about. Thank you for being here with us today.
Yes.
Thank you for give us some of your time, that we know you are so busy, with your own publishing house. We didn't know about that. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your time, your words.
Yes.
Hope an utopian view of the fairy tales with us, and hope we all can construct a better world for children and future generations.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and so let us stay in contact.
Gracias por acompañarnos una vez más en el refugio. Esperamos que hayan disfrutado el primer episodio de la segunda temporada. Nosotras disfrutamos mucho tener la oportunidad de conversar con Jack Sipes, conocer un poco más de su trabajo y de todo lo que ha hecho en torno al folclore y a los cuentos de hadas. Cuéntenos nuestra última publicación en Instagram qué les pareció, o si lo están escuchando por YouTube, en los comentarios del video.
Y antes de irnos, queremos preguntarles cuál es su cuento de hadas favorito. Nos esperamos la otra semana, que estén muy bien y no se olviden de seguirnos en nuestras redes sociales.
¡Chao! Noticias del refugio. En el próximo episodio iniciaremos un recorrido por la historia de los cuentos de hadas. Atrévete a cruzar el umbral.